That brings us to user stories. User stories are one of the many different tools that people can employ to record what the user wants. The various of them vary between expressing what the user is trying to do and leaving the specification of the system alone, through to specifying exactly what the system is supposed to do. Now, military contracts tend to specify exactly what the system is supposed to do, but they spend an enormous amount of effort at the front to try and understand what the system is supposed to do, and they're very good at it. Business, on the other hand, hasn't got the time nor probably the technical expertise to take their business specialist offline and to get them to fully articulate and understand what the problem is. So the IT software engineers tend to be used as some means to help articulate and understand the problem. Now, the user stories are a very high level definition of a requirement, containing just enough information so that the developers can produce a reasonable estimate of the effort to implement it. They're a story, very slim, very high level requirements. They are small, much smaller than other usage requirements, artifacts such as use cases or usage narratives. They really are trying to get down to very small pieces of functionality. The user stories start out as a short headline, usually, and they're written in some sort of a pidgin language. Now, a pidgin language is usually used for trade. It's not one language or another. It's in places where there are a number of languages, such as New Guinea, where there are about 700 languages. Pidgin is the common means of communication between all these different languages. So Pidgin has words and constructs from all the different languages, and it's simply sufficient to enable communication to happen. Now, a user story acts as a pidgin language. It's not a precise specification. It is a means to enable people to understand each other. Typically, a user story is written in terms of a role, an action, and a goal. That is, as A, give it a role, I want to do some action in order that I can achieve some goal. If you can have those three elements in them, that's a pretty good start for a user story. Examples of a user story, there's a couple there. As a power user, I can specify files and folders to back up based on file size, date created, and data modified. That one doesn't have a goal. Right? It's got a role and an action, but not a goal. The next one does have all of them. As a user, I can indicate folders not to back up, so that my backup drive isn't filled up with things I don't need saved. Now that's much better because I can make a judgment on whether that requirement should be implemented or not based on how likely is it that his drive will fill up. If I said, does the problem go away if I give him a bigger backup drive? Each of these user story titles is elaborated with more detail as needed when needed. Okay? Now, if you're writing user stories, here are some considerations. The stakeholders write the stories, not you. The stakeholders write them. It has to be their words, their expression. The reasons are fairly subtle because if you write the story for them, you tend to put in your own words and you don't necessarily realize when they've said something significant. So unless you're an extremely empathic and talented individual, I'd recommend you have the stakeholder write the stories. Use the simplest tool. Now, simplest tool is typically the back of an envelope is normally expressed. User stories are frequently written on library cards, 6x4 cards. They can be stuck on a wall. But I notice these days that Post-it notes are taking over. System cards, as they are called, you can get them, but you need to go to stationery shops and buy them. And they're really hard to stick on a wall. Whereas post-it notes you can get in all sizes, and the bigger ones tend to be big enough you can write user stories on them. There are also computer systems that will record a user story, and they have the advantage you can shift them all around the place. They have the disadvantage that they don't have a physical presence, and the whole idea with a user story is you can actually stick it on the wall. So use the simplest tool. Remember non-functional requirements too, and non-functional requirements can be expressed as user stories, and they should be. The user story does get an estimated or indicated size, the impression of the size. Obviously with the lack of detail you can't be precise about the size, but you can usually come up with some sort of relative size of the thing. We also need to know the priority of them. You know, how important is this to the client? And some other things to include are an identifier. So a more formal approach is to write in the following format, as I say, as a particular role. I want to do some action in order that achieve some goal. If you want to get formal, and some people do, right. So here's what your user story ought to have. It ought to have a title. It ought to have space for who it's been assigned to implement. It ought to have some sort of a priority. It ought to have some sort of an estimate, and it ought to provide the detail. The detail could expand as happens. What usually happens with the user story is somebody takes the user story and goes to the user who wrote it, and then clarify the details and find out exactly what's involved. Prior to that is merely a headline to indicate roughly what's going on. Now there is an example of a user story. This is a copy of one that I think I Googled out of Google Images or something of that nature. But I wanted to get an actual typical user story, not the theoretical nice clean ones that you might have.